Hard. Now we're playing the game and we're totally scoring, learning how to make a virtual business boring, showing up every morning, ready for the show. I'ma get ready. Cold engaging virtual meetings 2.0.
Welcome to another edition of the Engaging Virtual Meetings podcast. If you are watching us here on social media, make sure and do us a favor. Subscribe, share, like, or comment. If you want to subscribe to this amazing podcast, well, then go to engagingvirtualmeetings.online and subscribe on one of your 13 favorite platforms. Did you know Apple Podcasts is still the number one platform for this podcast, followed closely by Spotify? Just as a reminder, come join us for the Engaging Conference. If you want the best in engagement, whether it's in-person, hybrid, or virtual, come to engagingvirtualmeetings.com/con. We are going hybrid for the first time this year, and we're so excited because we are showing some amazing new technology, and not one, not two, but 3 Hall of Fame speakers. I really want to give a shout out to all my Asian brothers and sisters who showed up yesterday. We had our very first Asian Pacific Islanders speaker showcase, and it was monumental. Go check it out on YouTube. It's youtube.com/engagingvirtualmeetings. Look for the live and look for API Speaker Showcase. Again, API or Asian Pacific Islander Speaker Showcase. Now, this next guest, he said he had one too many failed presentations. He said he knew that he needed to improve. So he created a company called Teach the Geek. Yeah, somebody after my own heart. And I'm so excited because I'm going to share with you that he just clocked a brand new article on Inc. called Being a Podcast Guest Can Help Your Business. How apropos is that? Let's welcome in the one and only founder of Teach the Geek, Neil Thompson. Hi, Neil.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I'm going to go cut straight to this Inc. article, and then we'll have you introduce yourself. Talk about this Inc. article. You said it's your very first one. I'm going to give a shout out to my good friend Minda Zetlin, who is our National Speakers Association Northwest member, who is a regular contributor to Inc. magazine. How did this happen, and why is this so exciting to you?
Well, it happened because I asked for it. So I certainly looked into becoming a contributor quite some time ago, actually. So when they actually got back to me, I was rather surprised. And at first I thought maybe it was spam. But then when I looked at the email, it looked legit. At least the sender's email, it looked legit. So I thought, okay, maybe this is actually real. So I messaged the person back, and yeah, lo and behold, it actually was real. So they offered me the opportunity to contribute articles to Inc. And the one that you're showing here is my first one.
Well, all right, here we go. Wait, we got massive virtual audience here with you. That's so fantastic, Neil, and congratulations. It's a great thing to get a platform that can amplify your voice. Inc. is certainly a good one. So before we move into the rest of the content, I will reference some items here, I think, in the article. But let's start with this. Neil, for my friends who don't know you, who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm the founder of Teach the Geek. And with Teach the Geek, I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of technical audiences. And the whole idea of it came back when I worked as an engineer. I was a product development engineer in the medical device industry. And every month I had to give a presentation in front of senior management on project progress. And I wasn't very good at it. I noticed a lot of the other engineers, they weren't all that much better at it than I was. But I saw the benefit of getting better at it because frankly, I didn't want to look like a fool in front of these senior management people every time I had to give a presentation. I mean, this is a monthly thing. And so I certainly did the work to get better. I joined Toastmasters, which is an excellent organization. They have chapters all over the world, and it's great for practicing, giving presentations and getting feedback from others. So I did that. And then I wasn't the person who was not looking to give presentations at work anymore. I mean, the ones I had to give, well, obviously I had to give them. It was out of my hands, but now I actually started looking for opportunities to give presentations in front of coworkers, vendors, even presenting at conferences, outside the company. And so those are the things that I did to get better with it. And I kept seeing the benefit of it in myself and me getting better and better at giving presentations. And I thought, well, this could be helpful to other people like me. As I mentioned, I wasn't a unicorn. Other engineers weren't all that great at it either. So I thought that perhaps I could build something out of it. And so what it turned out to be, at least initially, was an online course that I developed for people in the technical fields. And it was called Teach the Geek to Speak. And then I developed a yeah, right. And then I developed a book and a workbook that could go along with the course as well. At first, I was selling it to people, so other technical people. But then I thought it actually makes more sense to approach organizations directly and have this as be part of their professional development for their technical professionals who work at their company. So that's basically what Teach the Geek is now. It's me doing presentation trainings with organizations that have technical people as employees.
So have you always identified as a geek, or did you find your geek later to get your geek on later?
Well, I've been a geek for quite some time, and other people let me know about it. I think that's kind of how it kind of works out. It's other people seeing that you're into other things that perhaps they're not into, and then you get this label. Initially, at least historically, it was a negative, but I think now geek is chic.
Well, I got to tell you, because I worked 10 years at Microsoft, and as you grow up, I don't know your experience. I'd love for you to think about to share some elements of your experience. But my experience growing up as a geek is that, well, one, you're Asian, right? I'm Asian. Imagine that. So they think you're smart at math. I did clock at like a 800, I think, on SAT, and technology, right? Math, all those things on the geek part. I owned an Atari 2600. I definitely got into computers. I was a programmer, so I can actually, computer. Oh, the biggest one I thought that was really cool. I don't know if you remember a toy called the Big Track. The Big Track was a six-wheel vehicle that had like a light that was supposed to be a laser, and you could program it. So you could tell it, go forward 6, turn right. It was logo in disguise. And it was one of my favorite toys, and somebody just reposted it. It used to have actually a dump truck, which is that you could add it into it, and it connected, and it actually had a controller in there. So you could tell, one of the commands you could tell was to dump the load and bring it back. And that, I think, is the signature parts for me as a geek. And it was not looked upon, right? The geeks used to get picked on at school, bullying, when bullying was like not, I don't know, it was to do it was a cool thing, as opposed to now it's like not cool. And then when I got to Microsoft is when I felt like geeks got their revenge, right? All the geeks became, very rich. They had a lot of power. They had a lot of money, and that the world relies on computers. There's more cell phones now than, personal computers, and the geeks rule the world. AI, right? Crushing the world right now. So anyways, that's my journey from the got picked on geek to like, the technology chic. What's your journey, Neil? Do you have any other markers along the way?
Well, I suppose it was similar to your journey, except for the Asian part, I guess. But plus I don't recall really being picked on. It was more verbal things. In fact, I remember I remember when I was in high school, there was a girl in the it was at lunchtime, and she called me Carlton Banks.
Okay, I'm gonna bring it up. Go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, I didn't take that as a compliment at the time. But now, I mean, looking back on it, I mean, Carlton, what was to be upset about, really? I mean, he grew up in a nice part of a nice part of Bel Air. He had a butler, went to a private school. I mean, hey, if you're gonna call me anybody, hey, you can call me him. He could dance pretty good too.
Oh yeah, the dance, right? The dance is the Carlton Banks. It was right next to. I mean, I guess Carlton Banks is a compliment next to Urkel.
Oh yeah, Urkel, I would have had to fight her.
Look at this right here. Somebody actually AI'd or did something to Carlton Banks, but oh my gosh, iconic. No, you're right, I think that was an important mark. Well, happy Black History Month too. Imagine that. Is that Carlton Banks was early in the stage of making geek cool in black culture, right? Because in black culture, I don't know, let's pretend like I'm in a stereotype. The rappers got all the attention at some point for being cool, but Carlton Banks really started to show that being smart, right? Country club, having a butler, that's actually where it's really at. That's I think that's a place. So I don't know if that's how you identify with Carlton Banks.
Yeah, I mean, hey, at some point it'd be great for me to have a butler. I won't complain.
You can get one now too, right? And you get an AI butler. What did we did? Oh, I use something called BizX here in Seattle. I trade sometimes my services to get dollars in a BizX, and I actually trade it for house cleaning, and it was fantastic. Let me just tell you, like house cleaning, this is like low on my engagement list, low on my. So there's still time. There's still time, Neil. Going on to the other part. So Neil, why don't let's talk about your article for a little bit. You said being a podcast can help your business. Can you give us the Reader's Digest version here of like why people should click and read the rest of the article?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen it just based on myself and being and going after or reaching out to various podcast hosts that whose audiences would be, the target audience for myself and being on their podcast and having people contact me afterwards to want to learn more about Teach the Geek and that type of thing. But I've also seen it from people who've been guests on my podcast. In fact, one of them reached back out to me and said that organization reached out to her to do a speaking engagement. And actually that happened a couple of times. Now I can think about it.
Woo.
And that was just from them being guests on my podcast and those decision makers hearing them and liking what they had to say, and then they reached out. And so I definitely see the power of podcasting, and I'm a big fan of podcasting, both as I mentioned, I'm a host, and I'm also like to be a guest. I'm a listener of podcasts too. It's a great way to get a whole lot of different types of information from knowledgeable people. I can't say anything negative about it, really.
Well, then, what's your favorite podcast right now that you're listening to?
My favorite podcast probably is The Wealthy Speaker.
The Wealthy Speaker. Okay,
Yeah.
say more. Why do you like this?
Yeah, so it's a podcast hosted by a woman named Jane Atkinson. It comes out every other week. It used to be every week, but I guess she decided to scale back. And it comes out on Thursdays. And it's basically she has guests on who talk about the speaking industry and various aspects of it. So I listen to it to just gain a lot of tips on things that I should be doing or I could be doing to advance Teach the Geek.
Bragging shouldn't be taboo with Lisa Bragg. Bragging. Hilarious. Why do you like this podcast versus all the other ones that you probably listened at least to one episode?
Yeah, so at least with this one, another reason, the main reason I like this podcast a lot is, of course, the useful information. But this woman, Jane Atkinson, she also wrote a book called The Wealthy Speaker 3.0. And before that, she had The Wealthy Speaker and then The Wealthy Speaker 2.0. So she basically has written an updated version of the second edition of her book. And I figured if the information in the book was going to be useful, that her podcast would be useful as well. So basically, I'm double dipping in the information that I can get from Jane Atkinson and her podcast and book.
Well, there we go. So there's the Wealthy Speaker podcast. And Jane, you better give a shout out to Neil because I just followed your podcast solely on Neil's recommendation. You put in the article too that say, how do we get started? So what's your number one piece of advice for, let's pretend like I'm new and you're talking with me, Neil, and I'm like, I really want to get on a podcast, but I have no idea this was a quote from yesterday. I have no idea what the frick I'm doing. What's your advice to me, Neil?
Well, the first thing is to figure out what you want to talk about. I don't think it's all that useful to just go on a bunch of podcasts and just talk about random things. If your goal is to build business, you want to go where your target audience is. So firstly, you got to figure out what you want to talk about, how it's beneficial to that target audience, and then find podcasts who target that audience. And I think going to listennotes.com is useful in doing a search there for various.
What was that link? What was that website?
Listennotes.com.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's the one I typically go to. It's a podcast directory, and you can do a search on various, on the types of podcasts that you want to guest on. And then
Okay.
once you,
Oh, I was just gonna say, Neil, we didn't plan this. I'm gonna attempt. Oh my God, did you see that too? It's searching 189 million podcasts. So let's look for podcasts. I'm gonna look for engaging virtual meetings. Right? Imagine that. That I might want to. That's. Oh, look! Hey, I showed up! Yay! Virtual selling. Healthcare goes digital. Message received. Speak with people. I don't know any of these other podcasts except for that first one. The first one's really good. So, emerging technology in business. Home service happy hour. I have never heard of any of these, Neil. This is a fantastic resource.
no, yeah, I firmly believe so. And then you go and check them out, and well, there's a few things you got to note. Have they put out an episode recently? So hopefully it's not a defunct podcast. And do they take guests? That's another thing you need to know too, because some of these podcasts are solo podcasts. So figuring that out from listening to an episode or two, or just going through the listing of the various podcast episodes, you can get that kind of information. And then I firmly am a fan of listening to a podcast, at least one. And so
Yeah.
that if when you were
Yeah.
to reach out to the podcast host, you'll be able to say that I listened to this episode, and you could even say what you liked about it or what you took away from that episode. Since podcast hosts want people to listen to their podcasts, and they figure,
Oh.
well, you listen to my podcast, well, maybe I want you as a guest. You're making yourself look good in front of that podcast host. So then once you're able to reach out to that person and talk about what you want to talk about on their podcast and ask if it's of interest, if it would be of interest to their audience, hopefully they respond. If not, you can follow up a couple of times, and maybe if they don't respond after that, then you move on. But if you do get a response from them saying that, yeah, this sounds like a good idea, let's book a date and time to be a guest, then well, now you're off to the races. You're going to be a guest on a podcast, and when you show up to be the guest, be useful, be resourceful, be offer insights to their target audience that would be beneficial to them. And if you do that, as opposed to just hawking your wares and just trying to sell whatever you're selling, I think that's a much better play than to do the opposite. So I mean, just be that resource to these people on this podcast, and certainly at the end of it, leave your information so people can get in touch with you. And a lot of times they do.
I want to highlight that last point, Neil. So here in the Northwest, I've kind of identified that the style, like here in Seattle and in general, the Northwest, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, is what I call anti-selling. That if you really want to sell and be effective, that you should practice anti-selling. And anti-selling is saying, bring value, find a way to be helpful, right? Really be interested in that podcast. Like what you should do is listen to the podcast, and if that's not you, move on. Don't spend the energy to get on a podcast you don't believe in. And I think then when you get to like a host, like let's say you're the host of the podcast, Neil, that if I can authentically, I think authenticity trumps perfection. And what I mean by that is I can authentically say, Neil, I love the name Teach the Geek. I'm already in. Whatever it is, right? The name alone is a winner brand. I want to speak on your show if you let me, right? I think we can have a geek, right? Because you've seen this, right? If this doesn't fit the brand of Teach the Geek, right? This is in front of my face every day, then I don't know what is. And so I'm just saying, what can I do to help you, Neil? That to me is what I call anti-selling, which is like you first start by saying, how can I help you? As opposed to, Neil, I got 42 things to sell you right now, right? I got signs, I got classes, I got my consulting service, and Neil is like going to start running at that point, going, you're not for me, right? So Neil, is that does the anti-selling match kind of what you're saying, or do you have your own particular version of it?
No, I actually agree with what you were saying, John, when it comes to selling, the idea of anti-selling. I mean, ultimately, if you wanted to be that person who wants to just sell whatever they're off, whatever their products are, why should people want to buy what you're selling? Is it just because you're a guest on the podcast? I mean, I suspect that you'd have to give something of value first before they even think that maybe you actually know what you're talking about. Just because you say you know what you're talking about doesn't mean you do. So that's why you offer the value. That's why you offer something that's useful to the people. Now they think, all right, this person knows what they're talking about, so maybe now I'm more inclined to buy whatever they're selling.
Well, Neil, I'm going to flip over to the other side too. Like I just want to give you some examples of horrible podcast guests. right? Like recently, I had a guest and they name dropped. They started talking about things, but for the most part, like for instance, when my girlfriend listened to the episode, they're like, I don't believe this guy. I don't think this rings true for this person. Like they're saying the words, but their body is not matching the words. And then they like immediately went into selling stuff, right? Saying like, click here and buy my stuff now. But it was like the first 10 minutes before they even offered any value. So those were some of the things of a horrible podcast guest. Do you have any other examples or things to support with that?
Oh yeah, that's terrible. I mean, and you continued on with the podcast even afterwards, or did you cut it short?
Oh, I probably cut it short, but yes, my podcasts are live, Neil. Right? It's like I can't really go back. I guess I could go back. It's really hard. I got to go get like to 15 different locations and remove the podcasts. But I'm pretty graceful about it. You know, part of being a podcast ghost is still like facilitating or guiding the guest, right? In this case, you want to guide them away from this, and I'm doing it for their benefit, not for the show. Well, eventually, I'm doing it for the attendees, but I'm really doing it for them, saying for my audience, you're not helping. You're not helping yourself at all. Yeah, but I certainly did not run long, right? With that particular interview.
Yeah, I don't blame you. But yeah, when it comes down to even podcasts that I've done where perhaps I wasn't all that enthralled with the guest, actually one of the ones that really sticks out is whenever the guests ask for the questions beforehand. When I first started podcasting, I'd actually send them to them. And I found that those podcasts were the worst because now you're listening to someone give a rehearsed answer to a question. It's just not as interesting to listen to or even participate in as another person just talking to this person, as opposed to something that's a bit more organic.
You saw my podcast format, Neil. I only asked 3 questions. Here, I'll tell people in the audience too. That, like Neil, now knows the 3 questions. Number one, and I start with the disclaimer. Neil, these questions are so difficult. Number one, who are you and what do you do? Number two, what has to happen in a virtual meeting to be engaging? I'm about to ask Neil this. And number three, right? What's the future of virtual hybrid? So that was it. Everything else is improv. And I tell my guests that before they show up here. And like 99% of them are fine with that. So what other formats do you see, Neil, that are really successful that helps a podcast, gain more audience?
It's interesting when you mentioned the questions to me beforehand, John, because if you had just sprung those questions on me, I wouldn't have freaked out about those questions at all. I would have been able to come up with an answer. I mean, a lot of times, at least for me, when I have guests on my podcast, I'm not asking them questions they don't have the answer to. The podcast is about them. And if they don't have the answers to questions about them, who does?
That's funny. That needs to be a t-shirt.
I mean, yeah. So the ones that insist on having the questions beforehand. In fact, here's a story. There was a person I met at a conference a few years ago, and I was telling him about my podcast, and he said, "Oh, I'd really like to be a guest on the podcast." And I said, "Sure." So I came back home and we set up time and date for him to be on the podcast. And he asked me to send him the questions a week beforehand, and I forgot to send him the questions a week beforehand. I sent him the questions the day before. And then he messaged me back and said that we needed to reschedule because I didn't send him the questions a week beforehand. I sent him a day beforehand, but I never rescheduled the
It was a tell, right,
Yeah.
Neil? Like in poker, it was a tell about your guest.
Yeah, 100%. And then I think maybe a couple of years later, just out of the blue, he messaged me and said, "Oh yeah, we never did that podcast." And I never messaged him back, but I thought to myself, "Oh yeah, we sure didn't."
My bad. So the flip side, though, Neil, is that I know some professional PR people, and that's why they ask the question. For instance, when I now have been trained that if somebody asks me to write an article, like for Inc. or something, I will ask, if it's an interview, what are the questions? And of course, what is the deadline? Is like every PR person is actually trained to do this so they can figure out, one, how much time do they have to craft the answer, and two, to get them. So how do you balance the two out, right? The I need to know in advance and I just going to improv some stuff.
Ultimately, when it comes down to, at least with my podcast, I tell the guests beforehand that it's 30 minutes or less, and I'm timing it. So if they go off on tangents on their answers, we'll just have to go through less questions. In fact, that happens more often, well, more often than I care to admit, really. I mean, I have a number of questions I typically ask, but if someone takes 5 minutes to answer one question, and a lot of times the answer isn't even all that clear after the 5 minutes, well, I guess we're gonna have one less question to go through, and it's unfortunate, but I mean I still am a fan of just this type of organic type of conversation where
Yeah.
you just pretend like the cameras aren't even there, or that there is no recording. It's just two people just talking, and me just asking questions about yourself and you being comfortable talking about yourself.
Oh, thank you for that. I do want to give a shout out to Jamie Nolan because she has a best practice too, I thought, which is after a podcast guest is here, she sends a gift to them. Right. So thank you for the time. Even though the thanks should be the other way, like when you're a guest, yeah, thank you for having me. But I thought that was really cool. She sent me 2 brownies and a card, and I thought that's something that's memorable. I do want to talk about this too, Neil. You identified something. To be a great podcast host, you do need to think about speaking in sound bites. And what I mean by that is like this, which is how do we play off each other like a natural conversation instead of me keynoting for 32 minutes on a podcast? So what are some of your strategies that you have to know how much to talk and how much to not talk?
I mean, ultimately, it comes down to, I mean, I did mention that my podcast is 30 minutes, so just pace yourself. I mean, I would just, I mean, 5 minutes for one question with a 30-minute podcast, that might be a lot. I mean, just think that, well, if I'm only 30 minutes for this entire podcast, and this guy's pretty strict on not trying to go over 30 minutes, and
Yeah.
oftentimes that is the case since I don't have the stamina for more than 30 minutes. Like I just think, hey, have your answers be 1 to 2 minutes, 2 minutes at most, so we can get through more questions. And a lot of times, at least with me, I mean, I certainly have questions that I tend to ask, but if the guest says something that sparks something else, well, then I'll ask a different question than perhaps I had planned on asking, and that happens all the time. So if that happens, then it's even more important to be cognizant of making sure that your answers are clear and succinct.
Okay, well, let's then do something really fun, Neil. For anybody who's ever asked to be on a panel or create and moderate a panel, my suggestion to you is to actually suggest back to them what I call the unpanel. The unpanel means that anybody on the panel can answer the question, but Neil, they only have 60 seconds. And so I'm going to ask you a series of questions. You're only going to have 60 seconds to answer it. I will show you a clock so you know what's going on. And when we run rehearsals, we tell them, get the most valuable and important information out in the 30 seconds, and then you won't get cut off, right? So are you open to this, Neil, to trying this format?
Sure.
Okay, welcome to the Engaging Virtual Meetings unpanel with Neil Thompson. I'm going to ask him a series of questions here. So Neil, what has to happen for you to be engaged in a podcast as either guest or a host?
Well, as a guest, the questions have to be of interest to me, and obviously the host doesn't know that beforehand unless they send them to me, which I often don't advise them to do. But in all honesty, I usually will try to find something of interest in the question to be able to answer it the best I can. And then as the host is just having the guest be mindful of giving a non-rambly answer. So when I ask, I do my best to ask questions in as succinct a manner as possible, so the person knows exactly what the question is. They don't have to think about it. What they have to think about is their answer. And if they give an answer, let it be clear and succinct. And I firmly believe that if you do that, then the likelihood of people just tuning out decreases significantly.
I want to trademark that non-rambly podcast. If I release another podcast, it's going to be called non-rambly podcast. Okay, so let's see. So what has to happen for Neil Thompson to be engaged in a virtual meeting as a guest?
Well, as a guest, hopefully, well, the first thing is I need to not be hungry. Because if I'm hungry, then I'm not paying attention to much of anything. That's a problem. That's a problem for virtual and on-site virtual and on-site meetings is being hangry. I don't like it, and especially if the food's not good. If you go to an on-site meeting, that's
Oh,
not good. Yeah,
bad.
terrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then let's just say that actually, okay, Neil has food. Neil drank some water. So now Neil can pay attention to what's going on. But Neil will only pay attention to what's going on if what's going on is being communicated clearly and succinctly, and people aren't going off on tangents
Mm.
and not sticking to what the meeting is about, what the event is about. And if that's the case, Neil is tuning out, and Neil is likely going somewhere else to go look for more food and more water.
Okay, but there are a few great, really great ADHD speakers. I actually want to give a shout out to one, right? You do know who Jay Abraham is?
I've heard the name.
Jay Abraham is like the top five marketing consultant in the world. He's worked with Tony Robbins, Grant Cardone. I'm name dropping, I know, but he's and Damon John. So and he is self-admittedly ADHD, and there are some ADHD people who can have the style that make it right. So Neil Thompson, can you think of at least one ADHD speaker that you actually really like listening to?
Hmm. I'm not sure I can think of a name off the top of my head of someone that I know for a fact has ADHD. Although I'm just a fan of speakers who are interesting to me, and obviously they don't know whether they're interesting to me if I'm just sitting in the audience. But if I'm sitting in the audience, it's likely because the topic that they're talking about is of interest to me, and if they're able to keep my attention by telling stories that are easy to follow and are non-rambly, then I'm way more likely to pay attention to that person. If there's a clear call to action at the end of their presentation, I always appreciate those, especially if they want me to do something. They need to make that very clear, and just making sure that whatever the presentation they're giving is just easy to follow. I mean,
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
point one and point two and point three
Yeah.
doesn't make sense for them to be in that order.
Journey map. Robbie Samuels is one of the best people I know in presenting virtual journey maps. He'll actually give you point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and give you arrows as he's walking through it. It's a really cool technique. I want to go backwards. I'm going to go past and future. Neil, what is some quintessential technology that you grew up that helped you love technology?
Help me love technology. Maybe it was the first computer that my family had. That was really cool when we got it. That thing was huge. In relation to what's out there now. I was never much of a coder or a programmer. I mean, I did some of that when I finally got to university, but just the idea of having that computer really made it so that we were with it. We were one of those families that we were one of the first families that I knew of that had a computer in the house. So I really enjoyed that. And then another piece of technology that I firmly enjoy is the microwave. Because
Oh, my microwave just broke. That's so funny you say that, Neil.
yeah, so I remember when we got our first microwave. Now we can make things much quicker than we did beforehand. Heat up that old piece of pizza. Now it's good and new. We don't have to use the stove. And I wasn't allowed to use the stove when I was a kid.
That's another story. I'm going to ask that. Why were you not allowed to use the stove? Go.
I think it was because I think my father thought I was awkward because I was left-handed. He used to
Aw, 10% of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, because so I'm the only person in my family who's left-handed, and I basically did everything opposite of everyone else. So maybe that was the main reason. He didn't want me using the stove, using the oven, using anything that could potentially. I wasn't even allowed to mow the lawn, although I wasn't all that unhappy about that because typically you're mowing the lawn, it's hot outside, and I didn't want to be outside in the heat.
Neil, I would call that left-handed privilege. You should just keep that, right? If you don't have to do chores, I'm out. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
left-handed.
for sure. I mean, all the other stuff they made me do, like the vacuuming and then dusting, that was fine. At least that's all indoors. But I don't gotta be outside pushing that lawnmower. Yeah, I'm cool with that. Call me awkward
I'm
all you
out.
want.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like we were just talking about because somebody said somebody proposed, right? And it's like put a ring on it, right? All the single ladies, all the single ladies. That's not left-handed. All the single ladies. Okay, back to the future. The future question, Neil. What do you see for the future of virtual and hybrid? I'm going to actually give you 2 minutes for this question because I like this question. Go ahead.
Well, I've attended a few events that were hybrid, and I didn't really like the experience because I got the sense that the people who were running it, it was more geared towards the people who were on site as opposed to the people who were virtual like I was. So, I mean, the future of it is hopefully people become more comfortable running such meetings and not forgetting the people who are there virtually, and making it so that they're just as they could be at least close to being as engaged as the people on site are. I mean, certainly that's a bit difficult, especially if the person that's presenting or the presenters are there on site with the people that are with people as well. I mean, there's only so much you can do, but I mean, ultimately, that's what I hope the future is people becoming more mindful of not forgetting those people, the virtual people. And then, I mean, if that's not the case, then damn it, we got to separate them. I mean, we're gonna have the virtual events, and then we can have the on-site events if you're not able to get the hint that, you know, there's two sets of audiences here. They perhaps have different needs, and we need to meet their needs so that people are more likely to come back. And that's really what it comes down to for me.
Mm. Great answers, Neil. You know, I hope that you come to the Engaging conference, and I hope either you watch it virtually, because you'll see we work super hard to elevate a virtual attendee to what feels like second class citizen to a full blown engaged attendee. Now, we do offer a free ticket on YouTube. And again, the YouTube, because it's free, we purposely make it a little bit of a second class citizen. You can chat, but we don't interact with you. And some people actually like that. They're like, oh, you can never call on me. Those are the camera off people. And so they actually like that. Plus, it's accessible to get the information. But if you want engagement, you want to either see virtual or Neil, I invite you to Seattle on October 1, 2, 3, and you can actually see the behind the scenes. Like, this is a super geek setup, Neil. And I really hope that you can be here. I think you would be an amazing member of the community for that. So we do that. We are really looking about how do we elevate that. And I want to give a shout out to my very good friend, Rick Altman. He ran hybrid 2 years for something called the Presentation Summit, of which he has 21 years of experience, where these are people who are the top in design and, for instance, PowerPoint or in presentation software in general. And he made that decision, Neil. He split. And because he just said, in his 2 years of experience, despite he really was doing it pretty high, I would say top 10% of hybrid, his experience, and he watched and he listened to his attendees' experience, said it was so hard. So what he did is he split it, and you can actually go to both because there's valuable. He does have breakout sessions. So if you go to the in-person for a small amount, you can also add on the virtual, and then you can actually attend in person the sessions that you miss because you can only go to one of the two breakouts. And he got really, really great response to that. He was one of the first who I feel is a pioneer who made that decision to split. So I thank you for saying that.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah, so let's do this. So I got a speed round here for you. I'm just going to ask you now, so like even faster than a minute. All right, so we're sharing too. Neil and I are trying to demonstrate how to be a great podcast guest, as well as hopefully how to be a podcast host. I would love, Neil, by the way, at the end, if you could tell me one or two things that I'm doing great as a podcast host, and even feel free to give me a suggestion to be even better. I'd be happy for that. So here's one of the things too. Neil and I, before the show, I asked him what questions he would ask if he asked Steve Jobs. I'm going to re-ask him the questions back, all right? These are questions he wanted to ask to Steve Jobs, but I'm asking them to Neil Thompson. Neil Thompson, Apple or PC?
PC.
Favorite microphone?
Blue Yeti.
Oh, the Yeti Blue. Hold on a second. I got to get... Oh, wait. Here we go. Wait. I feel better. Hold on. There we go. Yeti. Favorite camera?
Just a regular Logitech one, the external one I use.
Is that a 920, 930-ish kind of probably?
It is, 930.
Yeah, the C930. Yeah. Favorite engagement technology?
A microphone.
Engage.
This is Star Trek. Okay. Favorite sandwich?
Peanut butter and jelly.
Ooh, peanut butter jelly time. Most hated beverage.
Root beer.
I like root beer. I really like. Wow, that's great. What's a tech you thought of that you haven't pursued and why?
Well, buying an iPad.
You've never bought an iPad?
No, I figure I got a laptop. What do I need an iPad for?
Side note, it's really funny. I want to give a shout out to Tiagi, who's one of the top trainers. And he bought like the first iPad, and I was delaying my decision. And he's like was 76 at the time, and he's like, "Of course, John, I have an iPad." And I was like, I felt like I actually got shamed into buying the iPad. I would encourage you to buy it for the experience, if anything. You then sell it if you don't like it. What was the motivation for you to start anything in your life?
Wanting to be useful to others.
Yeah. Each one, teach one. During tough time, names one things that keeps you going.
Not wanting to be homeless.
Oh. Wow, that's a whole podcast episode. I won't ask because I would love to hear, but we'll do it later. Proudest accomplishment for Neil Thompson.
Probably this recent one, the one we were talking about, becoming a contributor to Inc.
It's big. Publish, publish, publish. What is your biggest failure and the key lesson you learned from it?
Let's see. When I first started Teach the Geek, I developed the course without getting any sort of doing any sort of market research. And what I learned from it was, the key lesson was do market research. Figure out what the market wants and develop something that suits that.
Outstanding. Let's give a round of applause to our guest, Neil Thompson. Oh my gosh. Neil, thank you so much. Let's do the small feedback. What's one or two things that I do great as a podcast host? I hope you don't mind me asking you on the spot. And is there anything that we could do, that I could do to make this podcast even better, specifically for Neil Thompson?
I enjoyed the music that you played before we went on air. I'm a big fan of Bill Withers.
Oh, we were playing Lovely Day, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah. Because I saw the recording, I thought I probably shouldn't sing along to the song, but it took a lot of effort for me to not sing along to that song. I really like that song. It's a beautiful song.
Outstanding.
So thank you for that. And then in terms of things to improve, I think I mentioned it in the interview. Even the questions that you asked me that were easy to answer, perhaps is it really necessary to even ask or reveal those questions beforehand, as opposed to getting someone's answer just off the cuff?
Yeah. So you're saying I could even get rid of my 3 questions that I send people. Is that what you're saying?
Well, essentially is you can ask those questions, but do you have to send them to the people beforehand? They could just answer those questions like they answer all your other questions.
Yeah, because they're not hard, right? Outstanding. Well, Neil Thompson, thank you so much. Congratulations again on your Inc. article. I'm going to do you the favor and share it amongst my social media so we can elevate you. And so people who are listening to this interview, go click and read on Neil's article, and then feel free to reach out. We put the website in there, Teach the Geek, and find out more if you need help from Neil Thompson. Or, of course, Neil, you are accepting podcast guests. Is that correct?
Oh yeah. So with my podcast, it's called the Teach the Geek podcast. I interview people with technical backgrounds about their public speaking journeys, and it's been so interesting to learn about that. And not only that, but their career journeys. In fact, one of the most interesting guests I have had, her name is Christine Vartanian. She got her degree in civil engineering, but never worked as an engineer. Then she went to law school and worked as a lawyer for about 5 years. Then she was a stay-at-home mom for 10 years. And now she works as a personal stylist, helping women with their wardrobes. Yeah, I certainly couldn't script that. So it's really interesting to see what people do with where they start and then where they end up.
Oh, well, fantastic. And sometimes they use technology, like the use of AI as a stylist actually could be a thing, right? Where technology might come back to her life. So Neil Thompson, again, thank you so much for being a guest. Hey, people, go visit his stuff, go subscribe to his podcast. And Neil Thompson, I will see you around in that cloudy thing. All right?
Great. Thanks again for having me, John.
Thank you, Neil Thompson. This has been another episode of the Engaging Virtual Meetings podcast. If you are watching here on social media, please do us a favor, subscribe, share, like, comment, amplify all the voices, including Neil Thompson's. If you want to subscribe to this podcast, you can go to engagingvirtualmeetings.online, then read Neil's article and discover how to be a better guest. Again, I hope that I'm looking for a watch and see if Neil comes, whether he's virtual and in the audience or in person. We have a limited 150 people that will be there. Go to engagingvirtualmeetings.com/con. Get the free ticket. VIP is only $97 right now, and the in-person is $997, and it includes meals all 3 days, all 3 meals for 3 days, all beverages, including alcoholic, and even some nighttime activity. So take a look at that. And if you want to be like Neil, Teach the Geek Thompson, then go to engagingvirtualmeetings.com/meet, select interview, and you could be the next guest here on the Engaging Virtual Meetings podcast. I'm John Chen. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.
Always start people and keep